Andrew Doran, who previously served on the policy planning staff at the U.S. Department of State and is currently a senior research fellow at the Philos Project, joins us now to provide his expert insight into what's happening now in Israel. Andrew, thank you for joining us again. The Hamas-Israel war continues. Israel says Hamas violated the ceasefire, triggering Israeli airstrikes in the south. What do we know as of right now?
Well, we know that the humanitarian pause, as it's referred to in Israel officially and on the street, was broken by Hamas. And Hamas has failed to keep the terms of these humanitarian pauses repeatedly. Despite that, the international community continues to get leverage in Western institutions and Western media on Israel by suggesting that it's Israel breaking the terms of the humanitarian pauses. There are, at last count, I think 137 people being held, 10 of them over the age of 75, 2 of them children, and the majority now are males. But Hamas has failed to stick to the terms as it laid them out, and there have been some pretty traumatic, pretty awful scenes on social media just over the last couple of days, specifically with an Israeli family. And so this trauma that began for Israelis and the Jewish people around the world has extended now into December. And it really has taken a terrible psychological toll.
Now, before we talk about that pressure, the Western pressure that you mentioned, negotiations to resume the ceasefire and the continued exchange of prisoners and hostages are reportedly still occurring. What might that look like, and for how long?
Well, the negotiations, certainly there's a segment of the Israeli population that is putting a lot of pressure. This is from the right mostly, but Israelis who are just being very practical about this, saying if we negotiate now, that gives Hamas more time, and it increases the likelihood, not just that Israelis are going to be kidnapped in the Middle East and around the world, but that other Westerners are going to become the targets of kidnapping, because it's going to send a message that this is a successful negotiating mechanism. The longer the war goes on, the more pressure is likely to come down on Israel from Europe and from the United States, from the West, to stop the war. Perhaps ironically, the quietest but strongest support for Israel's operations against Hamas are coming from Sunni Arab governments in the Gulf and in North Africa, who are saying you have to finish Hamas, or this is going to be a problem we're all dealing with for a long time. So this is one of the paradoxes. Israel needs to finish this operation militarily, but this is something that's just simply built into the Israeli DNA. They will negotiate. They'll negotiate to get a dead body back. And so certainly they're going to negotiate.
The Pope's comments after he met with both Israeli and Palestinians calling the conflict terrorism were criticized by some who called his words ambiguous, while others took offense at the insinuation of the Israeli counterattack as terror. What should we consider in the Holy Father's words? Is he involved in these peacekeeping efforts? I know he wouldn't want them called that.
Well, I think, I don't know who on the Pope's staff might be an expert in urban combat, for example. But if you look at the plans that we reportedly proposed to the Israelis for Mosul and Raqqa, which I saw firsthand in 2017, that included a very powerful barrage of airstrikes that was pretty indiscriminate. They do their best to work around that. I am a little bit surprised that the Israelis opted for the approach that they did, which was to put more IDF soldiers at risk and reduce the reliance on airstrikes. So far, they've been able to keep both civilian casualties comparatively low and IDF casualties low. The Israelis probably, when this is done, will have provided a blueprint for how to conduct urban combat in a high population density area where human shields are being availed by state actors and quasi-state actors and terrorist groups like Hamas. That's how a lot of people who are observing this more closely see it. And so the Pope's remarks suggesting that the IDF is in any way comparable to Hamas is deeply disconcerting. There are several hundred Palestinian Christians in Gaza. There are many thousands of Palestinian Christians in the West Bank, and there are millions around the region. And if the Vatican were to speak as candidly and as freely as it's able to about Israel and its criticisms, if it were to do the same about Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Palestinian Authority, other Muslim majority governments,
they might not be safe.
They would absolutely not be safe, and that's a well-known fact. But it's something that if you're not an expert, you haven't traveled the region, you don't know to read between the lines, and so criticism ends up being leveled against Israel in a way that suggests that there's moral parity, and that all things being equal, perhaps that wouldn't be a problem. But we're living at a time of unprecedented anti-Semitism here in the United States, and anti-Semitism that we've not seen in Europe since 1945, and anti-Semitism spreading around the world. And if Catholics think that it's going to stop there, they're mistaken. We really ought to know better, and the Catholic Church's hierarchy ought to either speak with moral clarity or perhaps be silent.
Andrew, Secretary Blinken warned this week that Israel has weeks, not months, to complete the objective of destroying Hamas. What kind of an impact does that pressure, that Western pressure you discussed, have?
Well, it's unfortunate that Secretary Blinken set a deadline, because this gives this means that time is now the ally of Hamas rather than Israel, rather than the IDF. And this is happening at a time that Israel's also under pressure to conduct these humanitarian pauses to get their hostages back. Unfortunately, this probably makes it less likely that Israel will be able to both get its hostages back and achieve its mission objectives militarily, which would leave Hamas essentially in place. So this is deeply troubling.
To the detriment of many others who fear the reign of Hamas. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Of course.